Welcome to the AIER Standard, a production of the American Institute for Economic Research. I'm Ethan Yang. On August 9th, 2022, the Associated Press reported that President Biden signed a bipartisan bill authorizing $280 billion to boost high-tech manufacturing, $52 billion of which goes to semiconductors. These advanced microchips support virtually every piece of technology from cars to phones to computers. U.S. semiconductor production has fallen over the years as the vast majority of chip production now occurs in just two Northeast Asian countries, Japan, and a de facto independent nation of Taiwan. Taiwan in particular commands around 62% of global foundry share, that is, microchips produced on contract, and up to 92% for the most advanced semiconductors. China and the U.S. are currently in the midst of a technology competition to see who will control the future of the cutting edge. Furthermore, an invasion of Taiwan by the Chinese, as they're increasingly threatening, will certainly jeopardize American national security when it comes to access to these semiconductors. Joining us today is Dorothy Chan, a data analyst at SupChina, a startup focusing on objective analysis of Chinese affairs for business executives and China watchers alike, joins us today. Dorothy also had the pleasure of interning for AIER, as well as working specifically on China, which also gave her the displeasure of working alongside me. Dorothy, welcome back to AIER and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Ethan.
Of course. So we I guess we have to talk about it, right? These podcasts are published on a biweekly schedule, so this is probably not going to come out soon, but while we're recording, we're just seeing the fallout of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. The Chinese have been testing missiles. They've been testing their military maneuvers around the island, essentially trying to demonstrate that they're very unhappy with the speaker's visit. So, on that notion, what is the context, right, behind the current turmoil that we're seeing today?
Right. So, broadest context is this is going on amidst deteriorating geopolitical relationships between the U.S. and China. But also, what's very interesting about this visit, and as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi likes to claim, or that President Biden has been saying, I mean, the speaker is acting on her own terms, and this doesn't have much to do with the Biden administration. But, again, amidst broader geopolitical contexts, there's going to be a lot of political implications with this visit as well. And another interesting thing about this visit, more so from the Taiwanese perspective, if you look on social media and you see what Taiwanese analysts are saying about this visit as well, you can tell that even they're saying that they're getting caught up in this broader geopolitical conflict, because their voices in their opinions towards the speaker's visit is kind of being muted in Western press coverage over this event.
And that's probably an interesting point to illustrate, is that, of course, America cares about Taiwan. Of course, we support democracy. Of course, we support liberalism. But at the same time, we need to recognize that the world doesn't necessarily work like that. Of course, it'll be the most moral situation to, everyone get along, China respect the Taiwanese, Taiwan respect China. But at the end of the day, the Chinese also have an interest in Taiwan. And we do not live in a world where, America controls everything. There's no international government that says, this is bad to invade. We've already seen Russia invade Ukraine. So there's nothing stopping one country with an interest in taking another country from doing so. In fact, that's sort of the nuances that we need to live with, and just because we support Taiwan, we have to live with the reality that the Chinese do also have their own interests in the situation, and if they feel those interests are violated, that can result in violence. And I'm assuming that's what the Taiwanese are getting at. It's that, of course, we love the gesture, right? This is a great gesture. This is very reassuring. But at the same time, if you irritate the Chinese too much, you're going to put our lives in danger.
Absolutely, absolutely. And another perspective on this matter from the Chinese side now is that, yes, they are very infuriated by this, but, American analysts are saying, and even some Taiwanese analysts are saying, well, do you think that China's overreacting a little bit as well? Because yes, geopolitical tensions are at a low point currently, but to respond with, some would say, not that much reciprocity towards the scale of, I guess, the magnitude of importance of this visit. I mean, there has been an American Speaker of the House that has visited Taiwan before, back in, I believe, 97, a few decades before. So this isn't the first time that it's happened, but to respond in kind with live military exercises and effectively a blockade of Taiwan, some would argue this is China's own doing. Are they to blame for further worsening the geopolitical relationship right now between the U.S. and China?
And yeah, for the context for the audience, after Pelosi visited Taiwan, the Chinese promptly began military exercises, some of which including launching ballistic missiles. Those are missiles that fly into outer space and then come crashing down back to Earth, into areas around Taiwan. Reportedly, one of them actually flew over Taipei, the capital. So this is very worrying stuff. This is not the first time it's happened. So of course, people are very concerned. They're very nervous. But at the same time, I guess in context, this is not the first time the Chinese have started essentially launching artillery barrages around the island. This is, I believe, the third. They're called straight crises because they've happened more than once. There was two others before this. There might have been a third. I don't know. I don't have my history calendar on me right now. But this is a reoccurring issue. But I guess the problem is that these tensions seem to be worsening as China becomes more powerful and more able to challenge not just the Taiwanese defense forces, but also the U.S. and whoever else would intervene on Taiwan's side if it came down to that. I guess before we move on to the next topic, Taiwan is a very complicated subject in the sense that the U.S.'s stance, even though I'm speaking very pro-Taiwan, support Taiwan, support democracy, the official U.S. stance, and I guess my stance as more of an analyst would be we need to be ambiguous, right? Strategic ambiguity is the reason why we haven't fought over the island, U.S. and China, in the first place. So can you give us a little bit of insight on what it means to have strategic ambiguity rather than strategic clarity, and why that strategy in particular has worked out for decades?
Right. So the policy that's tied to the phrase of being ambiguous is the one China policy, where the U.S. and China have agreed that there is only one China, but there's no specification on whether that might be Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, or mainland China, so Taipei or Beijing. But what America and China can agree upon is that there is indeed only one China. And obviously, from the Chinese perspective, it's going to be Beijing. And therefore, Taiwan must be a part of China effectively as a province. Whereas, on the Taiwanese side, a lot of public opinion would suggest, Taiwan is independent from China. But to be ambiguous is basically to stick with that status quo of saying, we agree that there is only one China, and let's not get into the semantics of which China they're talking of.
And one of the points that was made during the one China policy, at least according to the U.S., would be, of course, China is China, but we neither deny or acknowledge the status of Taiwan. It's ambiguous. We acknowledge that China believes that Taiwan is. This is the interesting and brilliant semantics the U.S. has played, which is we acknowledge China's claim. Whether or not we acknowledge means we accept it or deny it is another question. But so this sort of weird ambiguity has allowed the U.S. to not only have a burgeoning trade relationship with China, but also maintain an excellent relationship with Taiwan at the same time. And I guess there are many critics today would say that the U.S. needs to strengthen its stance on Taiwan, become less ambiguous. And I guess the counterfactual would be if we took that stance back in 78 or 76, I forgot when the TRA was enacted, or Taiwan Relations Act. But if we took that stance, then obviously you would create an adversarial relationship with China right off the bat, rather than having the more nuanced, we can try to get along and let's figure this out sort of relationship that we have today. So I guess in my opinion, the ambiguous stance has led to peace and cooperation, but also allowing us to table the conversation about Taiwan for another day.
Yes, certainly. I mean, the question and even the military strategy behind reunification, whether you want to go about that by direct military warfare or even cyber warfare, either way, it's going to disrupt peace in some kind of way. So that's why on the status quo, I see it as definitely a forestalling measure. But at some point, after this upcoming party Congress, when President Xi Jinping gets his third term, there's still that lingering question of, but how much longer can this status quo hold, even though this is the best solution that we've got right now?
Mm-hmm. And the status quo is an interesting concept because although the strategic ambiguity and the promises that we've made, which the Chinese are on one side, I guess like the realist forces of just growing Chinese military power on the other is increasingly jeopardizing. Because I do think that we are moving towards a potential flashpoint if the Chinese believe that it's come to the point where their military is so strong and Taiwan's likelihood of reintegrating back in China is so low that the only solution would be to now use this military force in a successful fashion, which they couldn't use before. And that sort of mismatch of military superiority on the one hand and then a low likelihood of Taiwan returning on the other does prompt a war. And that's certainly why, I guess that's probably why we're talking about semiconductors today. That's why Congress has passed the CHIPS Act, right, to create more American semiconductor capability. But I guess before we move on to the more technical stuff about that, I guess a lot of our listeners are just hearing what we said and it's like, okay, this all sounds pretty rational. But why won't the Chinese just live with, an independent Taiwan, right?
That's a really great question, and I think it has a lot to do with who's in power right now. And I'm talking about one individual, and that's President Xi Jinping. He has a lot of personal history with Taiwan as well, and if you also consider his upbringing during the Cultural Revolution and that Maoist influence as well. I mean, ever since 1949 and those claims of Taiwan being a part of China. I mean, these are the type of things, his life experiences that are influencing him. Like, politics aside, this has been on President Xi's mind for a while. And then on top of the upcoming party Congress and on top of, keeping face and keeping in power, I mean, the Taiwan question, that's not going anywhere. It's not going to fall off the agenda.
Mm-hmm. And a part of it, I don't think we should make it just about Xi. Is much of Chinese society, especially the more nationalist elements, do find this as it's a personal matter, essentially. Mm-hmm. Taiwan must be taken because it's an integral part of China, and also for decades the CCP has said they're going to take it. And so if they just let off right now, then that's a problem domestically. That's a problem for their credibility back at home. But also, I guess from a more strategic standpoint, Taiwan is important to, I guess, the Chinese historical memory, the same way Tibet and Xinjiang are important, i.e. that's where invading armies used to come from. Mm-hmm. 1849, century of humiliation, right? This is this time period of just one invasion after another really does live on in Chinese psyche, and that's why there is a lot of strong nationalist sentiments surrounding Taiwan, surrounding Tibet, surrounding Xinjiang, surrounding the South China Sea, right? So apart from just the personal ambitions of Xi, and as well as the party credibility elements for the CCP, there's also just like a huge nationalist element or sentiment that's really motivating Chinese actions towards Taiwan.
Yeah, the party credibility part of your statement, that's particularly interesting because the way that I view it, it seems as if the CCP has kind of digged themselves into their own, grave with them. I mean, they've stirred up this nationalist fervor themselves. You're talking about like public opinion towards Taiwan. I mean, I see it as very top down as well. Their propaganda state is absolutely incredible. The way how efficient it is in skewing public opinion and influencing public opinion. But they've definitely dug themselves a pit because if you're going to take that strong of a stance and you're going to make it so public, you have to live up to it, which may or may not explain the live military exercises that are happening right now around Taiwan.
And I think that that's definitely a huge part of it, because just like Speaker Pelosi basically had to go to Taiwan after she announced, I remember there was, so just like Speaker Pelosi needs to look strong in front of her own people, she and the CCP also must look strong in front of their own people. And I remember there was I was listening to or reading a former CIA operative's analysis, and he basically talked about how the CCP is, when it comes to Taiwan, is actually quite pragmatic. Like, they're smart enough to understand that if they invade now, it's not gonna go very well. The U.S. might get involved, there's gonna be a ton of sanctions, right? So the CCP really does take a pragmatic, long distance look at this. But the problem for the CCP is that the people themselves are a little, those are the guys that want to go in right now. Those are the people who are, did not take, were not trained PhDs in political science and warfare and whatnot. These are the people that, their own population, but to their own fault, they've kind of whipped up into a nationalist fervor with patriotic education and propaganda. These are the people where they actually need to be concerned about. They could care less when Taiwan comes. They would rather not fight. They would rather just, the status quo right now is, it's not there's nothing really wrong with it. It could be better, I guess, if you're in Xi's shoes. But there's no war today. There's no sanctions. So for the CCP's perspective, they're pretty fine with this dragging on for decades.
Right. The CCP is, but these are the nationalists that you speak of. These are the same people on Weibo and WeChat. These are the same people that were kind of pushing back on their own government and saying, why didn't you shoot down Pelosi's plane, that far? And you can tell that there's starting to become some kind of schism between the government and its people as well. Just recently, I believe it was this morning, the Taiwan Affairs Office that's located, it's China's, located in mainland China. They issued a statement essentially calling for all the same old, peaceful reunification of Taiwan, which is interesting because it's going amidst these live military rounds. But, the government's definitely taking a little bit more pragmatic steps, at least in that statement. It seems like they're staying a little more pragmatic, but definitely not matching the fervor of their own people.
And I remember this also happened with Japan, in the sense that the CCP in Japan, obviously the Chinese and the Japanese have a pretty complicated history, but the CCP is far more pragmatic when it comes to dealing with Japan than its own people. And I think there's a protest, I forgot when this was, a couple of years ago, but they basically had to break up this huge protest. So it was just like, the protesters just want to stick to Japan. They want to, I don't know what they want specifically, but they definitely want to escalate tensions. They want to, I guess, probably get violent or something like that. And the CCP actually had to suppress that protest. This pro-China, pro-nationalist protest that's, seemingly supports the government. The CCP had to say, this goes way too far.
Because at the end of the day, social stability, that's the top priority, no matter, what the issue may be.
I guess final point on this matter, because I think we spent a little bit too much time on this issue. We can talk for hours about it. But I guess when it comes to U.S. policymaking, it's one thing to be concerned about what the Chinese military, the top brass, wants to do strategically. That's one question. I guess the most important question, however, is not necessarily what is China's grand strategy, what's their plan, but how the government itself needs to react to its own people. That's why I think that's Pelosi, for example, that trip. The Chinese government, from a rational perspective, shouldn't really care. But if you're a U.S. policymaker, you need to take into account that if we do something like send the Speaker of the House to Taiwan, how is the Chinese people, these very nationalist, less level-headed, more spontaneous thinking individuals, how will they react, right?
Right.
And because the CCP, at the end of the day, just like our government needs to react to our concerns, needs to react to their own people's concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with all that.
So before we jump into, because part of your research here at AIER was on semiconductor and specifically industrial policy, which is essentially what the U.S. is embarking on when it comes to its own semiconductor industry. Why are semiconductors so important to the point that the U.S. Congress is bent on spending this much money on it?
Yeah, so I guess I'll begin with what semiconductors are. It's also known as microchips or integrated circuits. They just conduct electricity. They're found in almost every single electrical device you can think of, regardless of the complexity. With the varying complexity of the electronic device, there's a reciprocal a complexity in the chip that you need to use as well. So the chip that you might find in a blow dryer is not going to be the same as the one you find in a car, for example.
So when it comes to, I guess, the tech competition between the US and China, because although we're not in a Cold War per se, we are definitely in a competition for, who has the best technology, who has the biggest economy, who's got the most diplomatic influence. So what is exactly the US tech competition, and how do semiconductors play into it, or the US-China tech competition?
Yeah, definitely. So semiconductors, I think in this context, it's because of its dual use applications that it becomes so relevant, particularly not so much the civilian side, but the military use of semiconductors. And especially since the US is growing increasingly concerned over China's military capabilities, obviously semiconductors are a very integral part in building up China's military capabilities as well, which is why it's becoming more and more pertinent. And semiconductors are just one technology out of many. So there's quantum computing, AI, and all those other technologies that are cloud computing as well, that are very relevant in the US-China technology race.
And when it comes to a national security concern, do you think that producing our own semiconductors here at home not only gives us the capability to compete with China because they're trying to produce their own, we would like to sell, our semiconductors, produce better semiconductors, but at the same time, if China happened to move on Taiwan and basically took out over 60% of the global foundry share, we would basically be at the whim of the CCP when it comes to, for example, if we want to challenge them on human rights, they might say, okay, well, then we're just not going to sell you any semiconductors. So choose between the two, right? So you think that issue is one of the main concerns when it comes to national security?
Right. That scenario is definitely a wait and see. But yes, right now the US is taking very early and proactive steps towards forming some kind of contingency plan against supply chain reliance on China. But I think something to keep in mind is being very careful about the use of subsidies and industrial policy in semiconductors. And you can actually use China as a case study for this because they've been doing this since 1950. So in that paper that I had written in regards to Taiwan and China's industrial policy, specific to the development of their semiconductor industry, again, China has been at this, since 1950s and building up and subsidizing not only the research and development component, but the manufacturing as well. And right now, if you look at market share, they're best at the very lowest segment of the supply chain, which is the assembly and package and testing of semiconductor chips. Maybe some manufacturing, SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. They're one of China's biggest, if not leading semiconductor players. They're particularly good at manufacturing as well as the lower end of the segment of the supply chain, but not so much research and development. So again, using China as a case study for industrial policy and promoting this idea of self-reliance, it's not going too well for China right now, which is something that America definitely needs to be very careful of, and they can't expect to pump in billions of dollars. So the CHIPS Act, and even the Senate and House have already passed their own funding bills, $350 billion, $250 billion, respectively, from the Senate and the House. They have to be very careful about the efficient use of this money because you look at China and much of that is actually being wasted. There's wafer facilities that are being constructed and not being completed. So, that's something that America can definitely look towards China and learn a little bit from because they've been doing industrial policies for so long in the semiconductor industry.
So I'd like to, before we jump into the substance of your paper, I'd like to preface it with, I guess, two competing quotes from other big name think tanks. The first one comes from James Andrew Lewis from CSIS, who states that Taiwan is spending $120 billion, the Taiwanese government, to build 20 new plants, including 4 cutting-edge semiconductor fabs, and is already breaking ground for new plants. Japan and Korea have improved subsidies. Even the European Union and its own CHIPS Act, a copy of U.S. legislation, has approved $46 billion in subsidies. Member states like Germany have allocated billions more. Only one country lags behind, the United States. This makes the semiconductor funding a national security issue. On the other side of the aisle, from the Cato Institute, Scott Lincecum and Ilana Blumsack write, Instead, the funds for new U.S. manufacturing facilities have mainly hortatory guidelines, meaning U.S. administrating agencies could disregard them and, just like U.S. subsidy programs, subsidize undeserving companies that just so happen to have lobbied the hardest therefor. Indeed, the Senate bill expressly earmarks billions of dollars for older, mature or legacy chips because Detroit automakers use them and Michigan senators helped write the bill. Also, China's tech dominance is exaggerated. So those are two competing, two takes on the CHIPS Act. So I'd like to jump into your paper, which basically, tries to make sense between these two ideas. You wrote about the Chinese versus Taiwanese semiconductor industries, one of which you mentioned China really not going anywhere. Taiwan, on the other hand, like we discussed, is by far the industry leader. So I guess first and foremost, what was the, a theory or hypothesis you're looking for?
Yeah, so I began with looking at market share of semiconductor industry, specifically between Chinese and Taiwanese companies. And the question that I asked myself is, why is TSMC, for example, so successful, whereas China is not nearly as successful? So again, the numbers that you brought up with TSMC holding 60% of the foundry market share, that is a lot to hold for one company, whereas SMIC holds in the single digits, market share 5% or less. So the question that I wanted to explore is, why is that? But I also want to see the role that the state played in developing, if it did have a role in developing these industries. And what was found, and what's actually interesting about the CSIS quote that you had brought up, I question the causation correlation. So in regards to the CSIS quote that you had brought up, I do want to question the causation and correlation claim that he's making between the total amount in subsidies and the development of a semiconductor industry. And in my paper, in my investigation of Taiwan's industrial policy, they had actually taken a very free market approach to industrial policies, which sounds a little dichotomous, but let me explain. Initially, they had subsidized the industry heavily, and they did choose players, just as China had chosen players. But the difference between China and Taiwan's industrial policy is that the Taiwanese government was actually a little bit strapped on cash. They were not willing to pump as much money as China was into subsidizing the development of this industry. But what was important about the subsidies was that you're basically building something from scratch. They had absolutely no infrastructure, no education, nothing to really support the development of such a complex industry, which is where government funds came in. But they were also very quick to privatize the companies. Like TSMC was one of those initial companies. And along with microelectronics, another large Taiwanese semiconductor company. But those two companies, they were very quickly privatized, although they did receive government subsidies. And if you look at their shareholdership right now, the government is indeed a shareholder of these companies, as is with Chinese semiconductor companies, although the Chinese companies have a much more significant government shareholdership. But in the Taiwan context, they've consistently held 5%. Year on year. It hasn't changed ever since then. So even though, the Taiwanese government may or may not still be increasing subsidies or subsidizing the semiconductor industry, I do question, that argument of, oh, well, if we pump more money into these companies or industry, therefore we will we will have established the capabilities that we're looking for, which is, self-reliant manufacturing of chips.
And so that's definitely an interesting nuance in the sense that perhaps some subsidies here and there might support some research. I think everyone agrees, from the most free market to the most nationalist, that funding for research, not really a bad idea. But if we're going to try to support, quote unquote, U.S. domestic semiconductor industries, then we need to start looking at, kind of like the poor incentives this might create. We might need to question about whether or not just tossing money at the problem does anything to begin with. And I guess one of the most convincing arguments I've heard against it would be that all these private companies that we have already understand the stakes of the matter. They already know semiconductors are the future. They're already pumping billions of dollars into their own factories today. And so why are we spending U.S. tax dollars on these semiconductor facilities when not only is the private sector doing it on its own, but now because the government's involved, we have a lot of lobbyists from all these legacy manufacturers that are producing not cutting edge chips that we're looking for, but chips that already exist, older chips. And so there's this money being thrown at these projects. So in terms of boosting or hindering progress on this particular question, what do you think? Have you seen anything from your research that points to any sort of causal effect from subsidies, whether that's good or bad?
Actually, there's not I didn't find a strong relationship. I mean, I can only look at the beginning of industrial policies and then the end result. And what I'm seeing is that heavy subsidizations don't do much. If you look at, again, China context, they've been doing it since 1950s. And they're actually ramping up efforts. And if you look at them now, they're still not pushing the technological frontier. And when I say like they're ramping up their efforts, in 2014, they issued their guidelines to promote the integrated circuit industry. And that's actually when the first venture capital state-backed fund called the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund was founded. And it raised billions of dollars, and it was pumped into a lot of semiconductor companies. But there's that question of, but is it being used efficiently, though? So that's definitely a big caveat with massive amounts of money and such subsidies, is really making sure that this money is not only being used effectively, but to your point, these companies have been in the R, they know what they're doing with their money. They have skin in the game. They know how much of their profits is being, reinvested into R&D development. And now that you have all this extra cash, government cash, taxpayers' cash sitting around, there's that question of how do we make sure that this money is being used to maximize, returns and, I guess, promote America's place in the technological race with China.
And this also goes to, I guess, a broader point. I remember back in, I think it was 2021, forgot exactly when, but President Biden, during a State of Union speech, basically said, we're in this competition with China, and that's why we need to do all this infrastructure spending. That's why we need to do all this spending on various things. And a huge blowback was basically, the argument was by President Biden, like, you are saying we need to compete with China by becoming more Chinese, essentially, in the way that we run our government, the way that we use our money, in the sense that if we're going to have this competition and we're going to be the United States versus China on this matter, then we should act like the United States, as in we should believe in market mechanisms. We should believe in the private sector and its ability to innovate, as it has. That's why, the U.S. has led in all these different industries. It's not because we, pump plenty of subsidies into it. It's because we just let entrepreneurship bloom, right? So do you think when it comes to, I guess I want to take a closer look at what China does with its industrial policy, because you have mentioned that the semiconductors have, that part of the industry has not gotten off the ground, right? And so can we also look at other sectors of the Chinese economy and just see how these subsidy programs are playing out?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've only looked at semiconductors, so I couldn't say, although a lot of other industries are listed out in their 5-year plans
Hmm.
that the government intends on subsidizing or has already subsidized. But I'm actually not too sure I can think of any other more like relevant industry or important industry that's
Hmm.
being subsidized by the government right now, aside from semiconductors.
Mm. But you can also point towards, I guess, not necessarily subsidies, but just a heavy-handed state engagement, whether that's, I guess, what was it, steel production or solar panels, the housing sector. That was, I mean, Evergrande, that whole financial crisis back in 2021 was basically a rude wake-up call of when you just have really reckless lending to basically prop up the property sector because it's so artificial and not necessarily due to these standard market mechanisms. It's more the government just trying to encourage property buying by having really loose standards for how loans are given out. They almost had a financial crisis. I guess you mentioned back to semiconductors. You mentioned there's a lot of waste, right? Can you talk a little bit more about what that means?
Yeah, definitely. So again, uncompleted projects is a huge problem. I mean, you're spending, I mean, Intel spent $20 billion building one facility.
Hmm.
Imagine spending $15 billion and saying, oops, this is too expensive now. I'm not going to put in the additional 5 billion to finish up this wafer
Hmm.
production. So that's the waste that I'm talking about. And imagine this on a larger scale. That's going to be an issue that Beijing is going to have to reckon with soon enough with their investment fund. And they're already into phase two of their investment fund since 2014. So the waste is definitely building up here.
Mm.
Hmm.
And so you think the same sort of issues can arise in the U.S. in the sense that if we're going to pump $52 billion into semiconductors alone, we do run the risk of misappropriating that money, possibly giving that money to projects that are not really effective, maybe not necessary, perhaps won't even be completed.
Yeah, I think this is a question of the mechanism, the distribution mechanism, and I'm not too sure if the American and Chinese way of distributing those funds may be the same. Obviously, China's more inclined to pick and choose the winners, and they're way more inclined to choose state-backed companies
Hmm.
as their winners. But in terms of America, I would hope that they take a more, free market approach to it. But nonetheless, I think like subsidies and industrial policies are already a problem. And back to your initial point, can I think of another industry? You brought up solar panels. That's a really good one. China did prop up their solar industry for a very, very long time. And what's interesting is that the Biden administration is kind of doing the same thing.
Hmm.
So back to your point of saying like taking or kind of mimicking Chinese methods and developing our own industry. But the result of China propping up their solar panel industry, which they've since stopped that industrial
Hmm.
policy, was a ton of dumping.
Hmm.
Which is why we put tariffs on
Hmm.
China, is because they dumped a ton of cheap solar panels into America, and American domestic manufacturers weren't able to compete with those prices.
Hmm. So I guess the final point in your paper, I want to go back to Taiwan. So I guess this is probably the most interesting point is that your study found that Taiwan basically the reason why it dominates is not because of its industrial policy, but because it stepped away from its industrial policy. And so I guess so. How would you explain, or how do you think that point complicates the idea that all these countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan to a lesser extent, China, European Union, they're all tossing billions at semiconductors. So why do you think the Taiwanese semiconductor industry just took off so readily, whereas all these other countries that are pumping billions into the industry can't really get off the ground?
Yeah, so I would caveat that with a little more history from the Taiwanese industrial policy side. It actually took TSMC specifically over 20 years to
Mm.
get off the ground, which is why I'm somewhat more skeptical about suddenly pumping more money and expecting rapid results, and suddenly catching up in the technological race in like 2 to 3 years. That I don't know if we'll even see results within the next 5 years because of how long it takes to complete these kind of projects as well. I mean, yeah, again, with the government's pumping a ton of money into these industries, I get that there's a sense of urgency as well. But again, I believe that these governments need some kind of enforcement mechanism, or at least some due diligence process to really look and assess at how this money is being used.
I guess to your original point about Taiwan's semiconductor industry, in the sense that causation does not equal correlation. So of course these countries are pumping billions, and perhaps they will get off the ground. Perhaps, I'm not going to doubt that the US is going to build its own semiconductor facilities. In fact, our own private companies are investing billions already, their own money. And so perhaps if we do get these domestic industries, which I hope that all these projects go great, right? But is it because we pumped $52 billion worth of taxpayer dollars, or was it because Qualcomm and all these other companies, already had a plan themselves, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perhaps in maybe 5 to 10 years, I'm also hoping that these projects go well as well. And like you said before, American semiconductor companies, so again, Intel, they've already begun constructing these facilities back last year. So I think to an extent, the money that governments are pumping in will culminate in something, but to compare it to successes that we've seen in Taiwan and even other governments that are pumping billions of money into their semiconductor industries, I would say don't expect too much again, because simply giving these money to companies isn't going to cut it. What Taiwan did was when I say they built it from the ground up, every inch of society was being promoted to support the semiconductor industry. So education as well. And a lot of their engineers and scientists were actually trained in the United States. So this is a very particular leverage that America still has, is that innovative capacity, our strength in R&D. So that's somewhere where I hope money will definitely help promote and grow those areas. But yeah, I hope that companies and the government alike are very creative in the way that they use these massive amounts of money.
And that reminds me of, the name escapes me, but a different policy analyst was talking about how, of course, this money might help, perhaps. Obviously, it needs to be used correctly. But the most important thing that comes with building these semiconductors, or building anything innovative in the first place, would be the whole entire infrastructure that surrounds it. You mentioned how Taiwanese scientists are trained in the U.S., right? The U.S. has these cutting-edge universities, cutting-edge research facilities. It's all right here, right? So it's maybe not necessarily throwing $52 billion at semiconductor industries as a solution. Perhaps it's just more so being, revamping or revitalizing or improving our research capabilities, making sure that we have the educational system to turn out good scientists, make sure we have good pipelines, right, from the right universities to the right facilities. The regulatory environment is also very important. I remember, I get the name escapes me, but he was talking specifically about how, in order for these semiconductors industries to really take off, you have to have basically regulatory sandboxes where people can come. I think this is happening in New York. He was doing a case study about this particular place in New York that was basically like shovel-ready regulatory sandbox. Like, there's very few regulations here. It's a lot easier to build here than it is anywhere else, right? And that's why they're able to attract facilities and factories and build new semiconductor production in those areas, because they create the regulatory environment where these companies can actually flourish and experiment and compete and hire people. So I guess the big takeaway from that would just be the money may or may not be a causal factor. Potentially no, potentially could go to waste.
Right.
But what we can't control, what we do know that works, is education, regulatory reform, infrastructure, right? And so perhaps that's where we need to be looking.
And also, we're also talking under the assumption that we can even speed up the development of the semiconductor any faster than it's already going. And you're talking about, in terms of America, it's already so mature. they've been developing chips way before the 1950s when China and Taiwan started developing chips. So really, I mean, how much faster can it grow and develop no matter how much money you put in when these companies are already hard at work and reinvesting the money into R&D? But also, to Scott Lincecum's point, I would definitely agree with that Cato quote that we may very well be also overstating the China's technological capabilities. So that's somewhere else where we can look to. If we can't speed up the development of our semiconductor industry, which is pumping more money, I mean, we have to look back at what our assumptions are that's driving these actions. And it's our assumption that China's, military capabilities, technological capabilities, they're far exceeding the US. And to some extent, it is in some areas. The Wall Street Journal did a piece on this in 2021.
Like certain types of AI they might lead in, but because the dichotomy of who's better at like the U.S. and China both have AI. They're both good at different parts of AI. Like the Chinese, they use it for like facial recognition and security, right? That sort of stuff. And the U.S. is better at, I guess, like data crunching AI, used for more. I guess it's almost like the philosophies of either country. Like the Chinese, like they look at AI as like I can do a lot of facial recognition and like lock up a lot of people with, you can, recognize criminals and stuff like that.
Right.
Whereas the US is like, I can use this to crunch numbers and make a ton of money, right? So it's almost like just a philosophical outlook, but go on.
We US and China, we do have very different applications of these technologies where it makes it a little harder to compare and measure, who's more advanced at this point. But I think like us pumping a ton of money into our semiconductor industry right now through the CHIPS Act and even prior legislation, if you're going to use that China argument and that China card, take a look in the mirror and, I see a lot of fear in these, in Congress's eyes right now, which is understandable when you see a rising world power right now, an economic challenger to America's like hegemonic status. I see the fear, but, don't let that fear drive and serve as the primary reason for such legislation, because it does produce some detrimental policies. So the trade war, for example, and tariffs that are sometimes not explicitly said, but country specific, those are detrimental policies.
And I guess it's not just fear, but it's the fear meets the sort of political incentives at play, the incentives to not only just find a really quick solution, i.e. toss money at it, erect some tariffs, but also there's certain constituencies that are very much invested in these negative policies, whether it's trade unions supporting tariffs or auto manufacturers and other sorts of industry unions supporting the subsidies, right? So it's not just a fear factor, it's just fear meets political incentives here at home. So I guess that's another danger that we have to look out for.
Yeah, definitely. Interest groups. Definitely. Yeah.
Well, that concludes a very fascinating conversation on a very important topic. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dorothy Chan is an author of a research study that she conducted here at AIER, which looks at the implications of Chinese versus Taiwanese industrial policy. She is a data analyst at SupChina, and I believe you're moving on to a new company. Am I right? Is that correct?
I am. So I'll be starting a new role at PitchBook as a data operations associate on their Greater China team.
Very nice. Well, she also was an intern here at the American Institute for Economic Research, so we would like to claim as much credit as possible for Dorothy's continued success. And of course, I'd have to thank her for bearing with me as she worked during her internship, as she worked alongside me. But if you liked what you heard today and you would like to find more of AIER's content, make sure to follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, as well as check out our website at aier.org. If you really liked what you heard today and you want to support more cutting-edge research and more interns like Dorothy, make sure to become a donor. All the information and more can be found at aier.org. Thank you.